Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am going to be recommending for you some non-fiction books. So, for as long as I've been doing my channel, I really haven't read that much non-fiction, but I don't know why, because I do really enjoy it. And at the beginning of this year, I was reading a lot of non-fiction, so that's kind of weird. Anyway, because I really do like certain nonfiction and I'm picky about what I like, I thought that I would share with you guys some of my favorite nonfiction that I've read. This can include nonfiction that's historical, there's a nonfiction book that is about psychology, and I have a couple of memoirs. So we are just going to get into it so I can recommend to you some nonfiction that I think is particularly interesting. Because while I do think that nonfiction is important and I think it's very interesting, I can sometimes get bored. So these are the ones that did not bore me, I really enjoyed all the way through, and that I think you will too. So the first one that we are going to start out with is Call the Midwife by Jennifer Worth. This is a memoir of Jennifer Worth recounting her time as a midwife on the East End in the 1950s, and it is so incredibly interesting and fascinating. There are more of these books that I haven't read yet. I've just read this first one, and there is an entire BBC series of Call the Midwife. Also, I haven't watched that, but I'd really like to, because I think this is an incredibly interesting book about her life and about the situations of the East End in the 1950s, and I think that it's just very truthful and very interesting and a very cool look at that point in time that I think I had never seen before, so highly recommend. Next up, I would like to talk about The Devil in the White City by Erik Larsen. This is a fairly famous nonfiction book, and I think it's for good reason because I think it's a really good book. This book tells two intertwining storylines, the first of which being the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which was an incredible feat of engineering and planning and was just amazing, alongside the story of famous serial killer H.H. Holmes, who lived in Chicago at the time. This book is really interesting. I really liked it, and I think it gives a lot of information about the Chicago World's Fair, which is really fascinating, and how that was built and how that grew. And it gives as much information as it can possibly give about H.H. Holmes, because there is not a ton known about him. My only complaint about this book is that I wanted more H.H. Holmes, but I realize the reasons. So this is a really interesting look at Chicago in a very interesting time, and the stuff with H.H. Holmes is very chilling, very creepy, and also you read it kind of going, how did none of you know this guy was killing people? This guy is the easiest guy to identify as a serial killer. He legitimately invites contractors to his home and asks them to build a soundproof, like, torture safe, and they're like, this is probably fine. Guys. Anyway, off topic, is a very fascinating book, definitely taught me a lot about the World Fair, definitely gave me some information about H.H. Holmes, and I really liked it. Next up, we're coming to another memoir, and that is My 13th Winter by Samantha Beal. This is a middle grade memoir, so this can be passed on to younger people. I passed it on to my younger sister a few years ago, and she really enjoyed it. This is about a girl named Samantha who has perfect grades, but she can't do really basic things like remember the combination to her locker or figure out change at a checkout counter. And it is in her 13th year when she decides that she has to address the issue and accept the fact that she has a learning disability. And this is just a really quick book, very quick, recounting her story of dealing with that, about learning about herself and how she can deal with moving past this learning disability despite the fact that she's always thought of herself as this incredibly smart person, and suddenly she feels like she can't identify with that, which is very difficult for her, when of course she is smart, but learning to deal with a learning disability can be so incredibly difficult. So this is just, I think, a very important memoir, and one I'm really glad that I passed on to my sister when she was younger, and I think that it is something that more young people should read, because I think it can really prepare you for the future and for dealing for that kind of thing, and for being more understanding of other people who are dealing with learning disabilities and learning to deal with that side of themselves. Very much enjoyed this book. Next up, I would like to talk about one of the many nonfiction books that I read this year, and that is The Story of Jane by Laura Caplan. This is a book that I read for my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies class, and it is fascinating. This is a book talking about the 4 years that took place before the historic 1973 Roe versus Wade decision regarding abortion. And before that point, it was completely illegal. And so there was a group that called themselves Jane, and they were an underground abortion service that did what they could to offer options to women. And while it started as a very, very small organization, it grew significantly over 4 years and developed into this huge, huge thing which helped so many women. This book was completely fascinating. I absolutely loved it. I read it really, really quickly because it completely held my interest. Talking about Jane and all of the different women within Jane was so fascinating, but also hearing all the stories about the different women during this time who were completely alone and didn't know what to do or where to go, and they had these women to turn to. The sacrifice that the women of Jane made, the sacrifices that they had to continue to make for years in order to build this service. Completely amazing, such an interesting book, so glad I read it. Next, I would like to talk about Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. This is that book that I mentioned that is about psychology. Blink is called The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, and it is about the fact that your brain figures stuff out a lot quicker than you think it does. It can make split-second decisions which might be more accurate than you think they are because the brain is processing things more quickly than you can even deal with. This is a really interesting book that I read a few years ago, and Malcolm Gladwell is a nonfiction writer. He's written 2 or 3 other books, none of which that I've read, but that I've had highly recommended to me. But it is just a fascinating book about understanding your own brain and understanding when it's okay to trust yourself when you just make a split-second decision that might not be wrong just because it's a split-second decision. He talks to some really interesting people, and there's some really interesting science behind it. So cool. Next, I'm going to talk about The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester. This is a true story of how the Oxford English Dictionary was born, which is something I've always wondered about. And then my mom just kept telling me to read this book, and she was like, you know how you're always wondering how they made the dictionary? I have a book right here. Read it. Finally read it. Very interesting. It's not how I was expecting that the dictionary was made. But this book tells the story along 2 storylines. The storyline of the guy who started work on the Oxford English Dictionary and the guy who helped them the most of all. He was absolutely integral in creating the Oxford English Dictionary, but he was mad. So this is a just completely fascinating story of how the dictionary was built and also the relationship of these 2 men and how they worked together to create something that's so important to us that I think we kind of take for granted, that someone had to build the dictionary, someone had to write all of those definitions. It's just something that's so fascinating to me, so I'm really glad that a book existed that could tell me. So if you really like reading and if you're curious about the dictionary and curious about the story, because it was a really weird story that was very interesting, definitely recommend that. Next, I would just like to quickly mention Yes Please by Amy Poehler. This is her memoir that I read very close to the beginning of this year. I got it for Christmas and absolutely loved it. I wish I had my copy here because it is the most beautiful hardcover book with these big, thick pages. But Amy Poehler just tells an incredible story, and she's so funny and interesting, and the life that she's led has been so interesting. And so I think a lot of the anecdotes and the stories were funny and poignant, and I adore Amy Poehler, and I loved being able to learn more about her. This was such a great book. Next up, I want to talk about The Man Who Loved Books Too Much by Allison, Hoover, Bartlett. This is a story about a man who was obsessed with collecting rare books, but not collecting them, he steals them. And Allison Hoover Bartlett decided that she wanted to explore what this guy's motivations were for going around and stealing the just indescribable number of rare books that he took. The value of all the books that he took is absurd. I can't remember the number exactly, but it's just off the map insane. And Bartlett goes to a lot of different places. She talks to the man who was stealing the books, who was in prison for some of the book and out of prison for some of the book. She talks to book dealers, including one that lives in Salt Lake City, which was really cool because I live near Salt Lake City and I've passed the bookshop that this guy works in multiple times, so it's really interesting in that aspect. I think she puts herself into the book a little too much, so this is not my favorite nonfiction book, but the fact that the story was so incredibly interesting totally made up for it, and I absolutely loved this book. And this guy, John Charles Gilkey, is... I don't understand. He has no moral code, and it's so fascinating. It's been months since I read it, and I'm still fascinated by this guy. And the final book that I would like to talk about is Harry, A History by Melissa Anneli. This is a book written by the web mistress of the Leaky Cauldron, which was the biggest Harry Potter fan site, especially at the time of when Harry Potter was still coming out. But it is an absolutely fascinating read about the phenomenon of Harry Potter from when it sort of began and started to pick up speed to the release of the 7th book and to just beyond that. Because Melissa Anneli was very involved in the phenomenon. She was able to go on tours with people, go to conventions, have a front row seat in the web world as the web mistress of the Leaky Cauldron. It recounts her story of starting the Leaky Cauldron. It is an absolutely fascinating book, highly recommended for people who loved Harry Potter and want to experience that world again. People who were more involved with the Harry Potter world when the books were still coming out might already know a lot of what's in the book, but it's so fun to jump back into that world, and I absolutely adored this book. Highly recommend it. Please read it. It's one of my favorites. Definitely one of my favorite nonfiction books. Check it out. Alright guys, there you go. Those are my favorite nonfiction books. I know, I like nonfiction. I feel like I should read more. I'm going to. Janelle bought a book recently, and it looks really, really interesting, so I would like to read it, hopefully in the future. That book is The Profession of Violence by John Pearson, which is about the Cray twins who were mobsters. Very fascinating. There's a movie coming out starring Tom Hardy, and very interested. But other than that, I hope that I have given you some nonfiction books to check out. Even if you're not a big reader of nonfiction, I think that these are books that you will really enjoy and will really hold your attention. So I hope that I've added at least 1 or 2 books to your TBR. Really do. Thank you guys for watching. If you have a favorite nonfiction book, please leave it below. Let me know what it is. So until then, I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!